The coffee was cold again. Elias Rourke stared at the dark liquid in his cup with the weary resignation of a man who had accepted that the universe was conspiring against his morning routine. The Meridian's food synthesizer had been glitching for 3 days now, producing beverages at temperatures that seemed to have no relationship whatsoever to the settings he entered. Yesterday, his tea had arrived at nearly boiling. This morning, his coffee could have been used to cool reactor cores. He drank it anyway. Diplomats learned early that comfort was a luxury rarely afforded to those who traveled between stars. Through the observation deck's reinforced glass, the star city of Varanthos drifted like a wounded creature against the backdrop of infinite darkness. Its outer ring had been shattered during the conflict 3 cycles past, and now the damaged sections tumbled slowly through the void, bleeding atmosphere through countless fractures. Emergency force fields shimmered blue where hull plating had once stood proud, giving the entire structure the appearance of something held together by hope and engineering prayers. Elias had read the reports, of course. He knew the statistics. 14,000 dead in the initial assault. Another 6,000 lost in the weeks that followed as life support systems failed and rescue ships arrived too late. The population that remained clung to the inner rings with desperate determination, rebuilding what they could while the outer sections continued their gradual surrender to vacuum. It was a monument to everything that could go wrong when diplomacy failed, which made it, he supposed, an appropriate venue for attempting to ensure diplomacy would not fail again. The door behind him whispered open, and he turned to find Captain Yolanda Webb entering with her datapad clutched like a shield. She had the expression she always wore when delivering news that would complicate his life, a particular arrangement of her weathered features that managed to convey sympathy and professional detachment in equal measure. "Let me guess," Elias said. "Something has changed. The Kelari delegation has requested a modification to tomorrow's preliminary session." Webb crossed to stand beside him, her reflection joining his in the dark glass. "They want to hold it in the Sky Temple on the outer ring." Elias watched a piece of debris drift past the window. It might have been part of a marketplace once. He could see the frozen remains of what looked like vendor stalls, their contents scattered into the eternal night. The outer ring, the section that is actively attempting to kill anyone foolish enough to visit. They claim the temple has religious significance. Ancestral spirits, consecrated ground, the usual cultural considerations. And the fact that it overlooks the precise area their fleet allegedly destroyed during the battle. Webb shrugged. "They say the view will provide appropriate context for our discussions." Context. Elias almost smiled. That was one word for it. He could think of several others, most of which would be inappropriate for official diplomatic communications. The Kelari had always possessed a talent for finding the exact pressure point in any negotiation and pressing on it with elegant precision. Who will be representing them at this session? Senior diplomat Nyxara Vell. The name landed in the space between them with more weight than 2 simple words should have carried. Elias kept his expression carefully neutral, a skill he had spent years perfecting. Inside, however, something shifted. A memory surfaced unbidden. A reception on Terminus Station 2 years ago. A woman with blue skin and ears that swept back from her skull like wings. Laughter that had seemed to surprise even her. "I see," he said, and his voice betrayed nothing. Webb was watching him with an attention that suggested she had noticed more than he would have preferred. "You've met her before, at the Terminus function, briefly. We discussed the weather on her homeworld and the quality of the wine. It was very diplomatic. I'm sure it was." Elias turned away from the window, setting his cold coffee aside on a nearby console. "Tell the Kelari we accept their venue request, and have the cultural attaché prepare a full briefing on the temple itself. If they want to use location as a negotiating tactic, I want to understand exactly what game we're playing." Webb nodded, making notes on her datapad. "The shuttle to the outer ring will need to navigate through active debris fields. Our pilot is already complaining about the flight path. Our pilot complains about everything. It's part of her charm. She says this assignment is aging her prematurely. Elias glanced at his own reflection in the observation glass, noting the threads of gray that had begun appearing at his temples over the past year. She's not the only one. After Webb departed, he remained at the window for a long while, watching the broken city drift through the darkness. Somewhere out there, in a temple that had somehow survived the destruction of everything around it, Nyxara Vell was preparing for tomorrow's meeting. He wondered what she remembered of their conversation on Terminus Station. He wondered if she remembered it at all. The truth was that he had thought about that encounter more often than any reasonable person should. 10 minutes of meaningless small talk at a crowded reception, and yet the memory had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter that refused to work free. She had laughed at something he said, a comment about the tedious nature of diplomatic functions, and for just a moment the mask of professional courtesy had slipped to reveal something genuine underneath. Then her aide had appeared with urgent whispers, and she had vanished into the crowd, and Elias had spent the rest of the evening wondering why he felt as though something important had slipped through his fingers. Now he was going to see her again. In a ruined temple overlooking a graveyard, with the possibility of renewed war hanging over every word they would exchange. The universe, he decided, had developed a truly vicious sense of humor. He should probably file a formal complaint. There had to be someone responsible for these things. His datapad chimed with an incoming message, and he glanced at the screen to find a preliminary briefing document from the cultural attaché. The Sky Temple was called the Sanctuary of Ascending Spirits, built over 800 years ago when the first Kalari settlers had arrived in this system. It had served as a place of worship and meditation, a connection point between the living and their ancestors. The architectural style was typical of early Kalari construction, organic curves that seemed to grow from the surrounding structure rather than being imposed upon it. There was also a note at the bottom of the document, flagged as culturally significant. The Kalari would be presenting a ceremonial garment to the Terran delegation during the talks, something called a stellar weave, a dress woven from bioluminescent organisms that responded to the wearer's emotional state. It was considered among the highest honors their culture could bestow. Elias read this section twice, trying to understand its implications. A gift that revealed truth, a gesture of commitment that could not be faked. The Kalari were not simply coming to negotiate. They were coming to bear their souls, metaphorically speaking, and they expected the same in return. He looked out at the wounded city once more, at the debris fields and the flickering force fields and the distant spire of the temple rising from the destruction like a declaration of stubborn hope. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting indeed. The shuttle shuddered violently as another piece of debris scraped along its hull, and Elias gripped the armrest with enough force to leave impressions in the synthetic leather. Through the viewport, he could see the outer ring of Varanthos growing larger, its damaged sections catching starlight in ways that would have been beautiful if they were not also terrifying. Lieutenant Chen, at the pilot's station, released a string of curses in 3 languages that Elias did not recognize. She had been complaining about this assignment since they departed the Meridian, and he was beginning to suspect she had been understating her concerns. "You know," Elias said, attempting to keep his voice conversational despite his stomach's ongoing attempts to relocate, "when they described this as a debris field in the briefing, I imagined something more scattered. This feels more like a debris wall." Chen banked hard to avoid a spinning chunk of what appeared to have once been someone's living quarters. A chair tumbled past the window, frozen in the vacuum, its upholstery still intact. Flying through the aftermath of a battle is never pleasant, envoy. Flying through the aftermath of a battle in a ship designed for diplomatic transport rather than combat maneuvers is significantly less pleasant. I appreciate the distinction. The shuttle lurched again, and warning lights flickered across the console. Chen silenced them with practiced irritation, her fingers dancing across the controls as she threaded their vessel through gaps that seemed impossibly narrow. Elias found himself wondering if diplomats received hazard pay for missions like this. They probably did not. Diplomats were expected to face danger with dignified composure, not financial compensation. "There," Chen said, nodding toward the viewport. "The temple." Elias looked and, despite everything, felt his breath catch. The sanctuary of ascending spirits rose from the outer ring like a slender finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. Its architecture was unmistakably Kalari, all flowing curves and organic shapes that seemed to have grown rather than been constructed. The structure was pale against the darkness, catching the light of distant stars and reflecting it back in patterns that shifted as the city slowly rotated. Around it, destruction reigned: shattered hull plating, exposed infrastructure, the frozen remnants of lives interrupted. But the temple itself stood untouched, as if the violence had parted around it like water around a stone. "It survived," Elias murmured. "Everything around it fell, but it survived." Chen glanced at him with an expression he could not quite read. The Kalari built their sacred places to last. Something about anchoring them to the spiritual framework of the universe. "I don't understand the physics, but apparently it works. Or they got very lucky." Chen shrugged. With the Kalari, those two things might be the same. They docked at a platform that had been hastily attached to the temple's lower levels, the kind of temporary structure that always made Elias nervous. Temporary structures in space had a tendency to become permanent problems. The airlock cycled with agonizing slowness, and when the inner door finally opened, he stepped out into a corridor that smelled of incense and recycled air and something else. Something organic and faintly sweet that he could not identify. A Kalari attendant was waiting for him, a young male with pale blue skin and ears that swept back from his skull in the characteristic manner of his species. He wore simple robes in muted colors, and when he bowed, the gesture carried the weight of centuries of ritual significance. "Envoy Rourke." His voice was soft, respectful. "Senior Diplomat Vell awaits you in the upper sanctuary, if you will follow me." The walk through the temple was longer than Elias had anticipated. The structure was built vertically, a series of ascending chambers connected by spiraling ramps that seemed to float without visible support. He found himself studying the engineering with professional curiosity, trying to understand how such delicate-looking construction could have survived when everything around it had been destroyed. The walls were decorated with murals depicting scenes from Kalari mythology, figures with blue skin and elongated ears communing with spirits that manifested as geometric patterns of light. Some of the artwork had been damaged during the attack, their colors faded or their surfaces cracked, but enough remained to hint at the original splendor. "This place is remarkable," Elias said, and meant it. The attendant glanced back at him with an expression of surprise that quickly softened into something like gratitude. "It is old. Built when the first Kalari settlers arrived in this system, over 800 years ago. The stones remember every prayer ever spoken within these walls. That is a lot of memories for stones to carry." Almost a smile crossed the attendant's face. "We are a people who believe that nothing is truly forgotten. Our ancestors walk beside us always, watching, guiding. In places like this, the boundary between their world and ours grows thin." Elias considered this as they climbed higher. Terran culture had its own traditions regarding ancestors and memory, but nothing quite so literal as what the Kalari described. He wondered what it would be like, believing that the dead were always present, always observing. Comforting, perhaps, or possibly exhausting. Ancestors, in his experience, tended to have opinions about everything. They passed through chambers filled with devotional objects and meditation alcoves, and at one point, what appeared to be an ancient recreational area complete with a zero-gravity ball court. Elias raised an eyebrow at this unexpected discovery, and the attendant noticed his surprise. "Even priests require exercise," the young man explained, "and our ancestors enjoyed games. To honor them, we must sometimes play. I had not considered that aspect of ancestral worship. The sacred and the ordinary are not separate things, envoy. They exist together always. A prayer offered during a game is no less meaningful than one offered in formal ceremony. Perhaps more so, because it comes from a place of joy rather than obligation. Elias filed this information away, recognizing its potential value. Understanding how a culture approached leisure could reveal as much as understanding how it approached war. The Kelari, it seemed, believed that even their recreation carried spiritual weight. That suggested a people for whom every action held meaning, every choice mattered. They climbed the final ramp, and the attendant stopped before a large archway draped with fabric that shimmered faintly in colors Elias could not name. Beyond it, he could see open space and starlight and the distant glow of the inner rings. The upper sanctuary, the attendant said. Senior Diplomat Vell waits within. He bowed again, deeper this time. May your words find fertile ground, envoy. May understanding grow where discord once flourished. Elias returned the bow as best he could, hoping his form was not too offensive to Kelari sensibilities. Then he straightened his uniform, took a breath that did nothing to calm his nerves, and stepped through the archway into the light. The chamber opened around him like a flower greeting the sun. 3 of its walls were simply absent, replaced by vast arched windows that looked out onto the void. Force fields hummed at the edges, maintaining atmosphere while providing an unobstructed view of the destruction beyond. The floor was polished black stone that reflected the starlight like still water, and the ceiling arched overhead in curves that drew the eye upward toward infinity. And in the center of this impossible space, surrounded by the light of dying stars and the wreckage of a wounded city, stood Nyxara Vell. She turned as he entered, and the dress she wore turned with her, shifting through colors that had no names in any human language. Living light cascaded across her form, pulsing gently in rhythms that seemed connected to something deeper than mere biology. Her blue skin caught the glow and reflected it back transformed, and her ears, those elegant sweeping ears adorned with simple golden studs, framed a face that Elias had not been able to forget no matter how hard he had tried. Envoy Rourke. Her voice was exactly as he remembered, low and musical, each word given careful weight. Thank you for agreeing to meet here. I know the venue is unconventional. Elias walked toward her, his footsteps echoing on the polished stone. The debris field turned slowly beyond the windows, a constant reminder of everything that had brought them to this moment. Senior Diplomat, he said. The setting is certainly memorable. He gestured toward the view. I assume the location was chosen for more than its aesthetic qualities. Something shifted in her expression, too quick to read. Yes. I wanted us both to remember what we are trying to prevent, and perhaps to understand what we are trying to build. The dress moved like captured starlight, shifting from deep violet to shimmering silver as Nyxara crossed the chamber toward him. Elias found himself struggling to maintain the professional detachment that his training demanded. He had read the briefing documents about stellar weave, understood the biology of the bioluminescent organisms that composed it, knew the cultural significance of such a garment being worn during diplomatic proceedings. None of that intellectual preparation had equipped him for the reality of seeing it in motion. Your analysts will have explained the nature of this garment, Nyxara said, stopping a few feet from where he stood. Her dark eyes held his with an intensity that made his careful composure feel suddenly inadequate. They provided extensive documentation, Elias admitted. Apparently there were charts. A hint of amusement flickered across her features, and the dress responded by shifting toward warmer tones. Your people do love their charts. We find them comforting. All those neat lines and organized data points. It makes the universe feel more manageable. And is the universe manageable, Envoy Rourke? Elias glanced toward the debris field visible through the sanctuary's open arches. A piece of what might have been a school drifted past, its windows dark and empty. Not particularly, he said, But we keep making charts anyway. Hope springs eternal. Nyxara followed his gaze, and the dress darkened to something closer to morning. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the wreckage tumble through the void. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its formal edge. My grandmother prayed in this temple when she was young. She used to describe the view from these windows, how she could see 3 different moons from this exact spot. The orbital mechanics were different then. What happened to the moons? One was destroyed during the mining conflicts a century ago. Another drifted out of stable orbit and was captured by the gas giant in the outer system. The third still exists, but the city's rotation has changed. You cannot see it from here anymore. Elias considered this. So you chose this location not just because of what it overlooks, but because of what it used to overlook, what has been lost. Nyxara turned to face him fully, and the dress blazed briefly with something that might have been approval. You understand more than your charts suggested you would. I try not to let documentation limit my thinking. It upsets the analysts, but they forgive me eventually. She almost smiled at that. Almost. The expression reached her eyes for just a moment before professional reserve reasserted itself. The dress, however, betrayed her, its colors warming in ways that suggested the smile had been more genuine than her face allowed to show. "Walk with me," she said. "There are things I need to explain before the formal sessions begin. Things that your briefing documents will not have covered." They moved together toward the largest of the arched windows, their footsteps echoing on the polished stone floor. Beyond the force field barrier, the Star City continued its slow rotation, bringing new configurations of debris into view. Elias watched a frozen body drift past, some unfortunate soul caught outside when the attack began. The remains were too distant to identify species, which was perhaps a mercy. "Stellar weave," Nyxara began, "responds to truth. The organisms that compose it have evolved over millions of years to detect the biochemical signatures of deception. When I speak honestly, they glow with the colors you see now. When I attempt to lie, they begin to die." Elias absorbed this information. That seems like a significant design flaw for diplomatic purposes. It is not a flaw. It is a feature, as your engineers might say. My people believe that peace must be built on foundations of absolute truth. Negotiations conducted while wearing stellar weave cannot involve deception. Both parties know that every word spoken is genuine, but only your words. I could lie freely. Yes. Nyxara turned to look at him directly, which is why these garments are traditionally worn only in negotiations with parties who have earned a certain level of trust. The fact that I am wearing one now, in our first formal interaction, has caused considerable debate among my delegation. I imagine it has. Elias felt the weight of what she was telling him settle across his shoulders. You are taking a significant risk. I am taking a calculated risk. There is a difference. And what calculations led you to this decision? She was quiet for a moment, her ears twitching slightly in what his cultural briefings had identified as an expression of uncertainty. The dress shifted through shades of blue that seemed to deepen with each passing second. 2 years ago, she said finally, at a reception that I found tedious beyond description, a Terran envoy made me laugh. It was unexpected. I had been conditioned to view your species as cold, calculating, focused entirely on political advantage. But this man made a joke about the wine, and I laughed before I could stop myself. Elias remembered. The wine was genuinely terrible. It was, but that was not why I laughed. I laughed because for a moment the mask slipped, yours and mine both. We were simply 2 people sharing an honest reaction to something absurd. And I thought, if this man can find humor in the tedium of diplomacy, perhaps he can find other things as well. Common ground, understanding, maybe even trust. That is a great deal to build from one bad wine joke. My people believe that small moments reveal large truths. Nyxara reached up and touched the fabric at her shoulder, her fingers trailing through the points of light. I have watched your career since that reception, Envoy Rourke. I have read your reports, studied your negotiation strategies, analyzed your successes and failures. Do you know what I found? Elias shook his head, genuinely curious. Consistency. In every interaction, regardless of stakes or circumstances, you approached your counterparts as beings worthy of respect. You listened more than you spoke. You sought understanding rather than advantage. And when agreements were reached, both parties walked away feeling they had been treated fairly. That seems like basic diplomatic practice. It should be, but in my experience it is remarkably rare. Her eyes met his, and the dress flared with colors he could not interpret. So when I was assigned to lead my delegation in these negotiations, I requested that the venue be changed to this temple, and I chose to wear stellar weave despite the objections of my advisors. Because I believe that if peace is possible between our peoples, it will require the kind of honesty that this garment demands. Elias was silent for a long moment, processing the implications of what she had shared. The debris field continued its slow dance beyond the windows. Somewhere in the distance, engines hummed as ships moved through the wounded city's remaining traffic lanes. You realize, he said finally, that by explaining all of this to me, you have given me significant tactical advantage. I know now that you cannot deceive me. I know that your emotions are, to some degree, visible in the garment you wear. I know that you consider me trustworthy despite our limited interaction. A less scrupulous negotiator could exploit every one of those revelations. Yes, Nyxara did not look away, and the fact that you immediately identified those vulnerabilities, rather than simply accepting the compliment, suggests that I was correct in my assessment of your character, or suggests that I am very good at appearing trustworthy while actually being quite manipulative. The dress would know. Elias blinked. Excuse me. Stellar weave does not only respond to its wearer. The organisms can sense strong deception in close proximity. If you were lying to me now, or planning to use this information against me, the colors would shift toward warning patterns. She gestured at the shimmering fabric. Instead, they indicate curiosity, interest, and something else that my cultural training suggests I should not mention in formal diplomatic settings. The warmth that Elias felt creeping up his neck was probably visible, but he maintained his composure through sheer force of will. Perhaps we should return to discussing the treaty framework. Perhaps we should, but before we do, I want you to understand something. Nyxara stepped closer, and the dress brightened around her like a sunrise. Whatever happens in these negotiations, whatever political pressures we face, I will not lie to you. This garment will not allow it, but more than that, I choose not to. You have my word as a diplomat and as a Vell. Elias felt the sincerity of her statement like a physical weight. In his career, he had heard countless promises from countless negotiators, and most of them had proven hollow when tested. But standing here, in this ruined temple overlooking the wreckage of a war neither of them had wanted, he found himself believing her. Then you have mine as well, he said. Whatever comes, I will give you truth. The temple shuddered without warning, and Elias felt the floor vibrate beneath his feet in a way that suggested something had gone terribly wrong. Alarms began wailing somewhere in the lower levels, their harsh tones cutting through the peaceful atmosphere of the sanctuary like blades through silk. Through the arched windows, he could see movement among the vessels docked at the distant harbor platforms, engines flaring to life in patterns that spoke of panic rather than routine departure. That is not good, he said, because sometimes stating the obvious was all a person could manage. Nyxara's expression had shifted from openness to sharp alertness, her ears rotating slightly as if trying to catch sounds beyond normal hearing range. Those engine signatures, they are military configuration. Someone has brought warships to the peace talks. Please tell me that was part of your delegation's plan. It was not. Then I am going to assume it was not part of mine either. Another tremor ran through the temple, stronger this time. The ancient structure groaned in protest, and somewhere below them, something crashed with the distinctive sound of cultural artifacts becoming rubble. The dress Nyxara wore flared with agitated colors, its organisms responding to her spike of fear and anger. "We need to move," she said, her hand finding his arm with surprising strength. "There is a secure chamber in the temple's core. The original builders designed it to survive anything short of complete structural collapse." How reassuring. They ran together through the spiraling corridors, the temple shaking around them as external forces tested its legendary resilience. Elias caught glimpses through passing windows of the chaos unfolding outside. Ships were moving in attack formations, though he could not identify whose ships or what they were attacking. The debris field that had been drifting peacefully was now being scattered by engine wash and weapons fire, creating new hazards with every passing second. "Do you know who is responsible for this?" he demanded as they descended. Nyxara shook her head, her breath coming faster as they navigated the ramps. "There are factions on both sides who oppose these negotiations. Some believe peace is weakness. Others profit from continued conflict. I had hoped they would not act so boldly. Apparently hope was insufficient deterrent." "Yes." Her voice carried bitter acknowledgement. "I should have anticipated this possibility. My advisors warned me that meeting privately, away from our security details, was dangerous. To be fair, they were probably more concerned about what we might do to each other than what others might do to us." Despite everything, despite the explosions and the shaking and the very real possibility of imminent death, Nyxara laughed. The sound was startled and genuine and entirely inappropriate given their circumstances, and Elias found himself grinning in response. "Your timing for humor is remarkable, envoy." Stress response. "Some people panic. I make jokes. My therapist says it is a coping mechanism. Is it effective? Ask me again if we survive the next few minutes." They reached a heavy door set into the temple's innermost structure, its surface covered in Kelari script that pulsed with faint light. Nyxara pressed her palm against a biometric scanner, and the ancient mechanism responded with grinding acknowledgement. The door swung open to reveal a small chamber filled with equipment that looked older than human spaceflight. "Inside," she said, pushing him through. "This room was built during the original construction. The engines you hear are part of the temple's defensive systems. They create a localized distortion field that should protect us from most weapons. Should protect us. The Kelari engineer who designed this system died 400 years ago. I cannot guarantee her work." Wonderful. The chamber was barely large enough for two people to stand without touching. Ancient machinery hummed in the walls, creating vibrations that Elias could feel in his teeth. The only illumination came from Nyxara's dress, its bioluminescent organisms casting shifting patterns across the confined space. She sealed the door behind them, and the heavy lock engaged with a sound of absolute finality. In the sudden relative quiet, Elias became acutely aware of how close they were standing. Her shoulder nearly touched his chest. Her breath was warm against his cheek. The dress glowed between them like a living thing, its colors cycling through patterns he was beginning to understand. "That dress was made for you," he said, and the words came out before wisdom could stop them. Nyxara looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the shifting light. "The dress responds to truth," she said quietly. "And right now it is telling me things I should probably ignore. Such as the fact that standing in a sealed chamber with you, while unknown forces attempt to destroy everything around us, I feel safer than I have in years. Such as the fact that my hearts, and yes, I have two of them which I am sure your briefings mentioned, are beating in patterns that suggest attraction rather than fear. Such as the fact that I am having difficulty remembering why diplomatic protocols exist." Elias swallowed. That is quite a lot for a dress to communicate. Stellar weave is very expressive. Through the thick walls, the sounds of conflict continued, muffled but still audible. Ships exchanging fire, structures collapsing, the distant screaming of emergency alerts. And yet in this small space, surrounded by ancient technology and the gentle glow of living fabric, None of it seemed to matter quite as much as it should. "We should probably discuss what happens when we leave this room," Elias said. "Assuming we leave this room. Assuming there is anything left to leave to." "Yes, we probably should." Neither of them moved. "The peace talks," Elias continued, aware that he was rambling but unable to stop. "They will be complicated by whatever is happening out there. Both sides will blame the other. Trust will be damaged. The work we came here to do may become impossible." "That is likely true. And yet I find myself thinking about wine jokes and laughter, and the way your ears move when you are trying not to smile." Nyxara's ears did exactly what he had described, twitching in that characteristic expression of suppressed amusement. "You are very observant for someone who claims to rely on charts. I pay attention to things that matter." The dress flared golden, and Nyxara made a sound that might have been frustration or surrender or both. "This is highly inappropriate," she said. "Diplomatic protocol specifically prohibits personal entanglements between negotiating parties." "Does it specifically prohibit entanglements or just discourage them?" "I am not certain. I may have stopped paying attention during that portion of my training." Elias laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the small chamber, mixing with the hum of ancient engines and the distant thunder of conflict. Around them, the temple continued to hold, its 800-year-old defenses proving equal to whatever forces assaulted them. "When we get out of here," he said, "and I choose to believe we will, we are going to face difficult choices. About our duties, about our peoples, about what we are willing to risk for something that may never be possible. I know. But whatever happens, whatever the formal negotiations bring or fail to bring, I want you to know that meeting you is the most significant thing that has happened to me since I entered diplomatic service. And not because of politics or treaties or the fate of civilizations. Because of wine jokes and honest laughter, and the way truth looks when it is wearing living starlight." Nyxara was silent for a long moment. The dress cycled through colors that seemed to encompass everything she could not say. Then she reached up and touched his face with fingers that were cool and gentle and absolutely certain. "Then we will find a way," she said. "My people believe that the ancestors guide us toward connections that matter, that some meetings are written in the pattern of the universe itself. I did not believe that until tonight. And now I am standing in a sealed room with a man who makes inappropriate jokes during crises, wearing a dress that will not let me hide what I feel, while war murmurs outside these walls. And I am choosing to trust that this moment means something, that it will lead somewhere worth going." The temple shuddered one final time, and then the sounds of conflict began to fade. The engines around them shifted pitch, suggesting that whatever threat had prompted the attack was receding. They would emerge soon into a changed landscape, into complications and consequences, and the difficult work of building peace from the rubble of near disaster. But for now, in this small space where truth could not hide, two people stood closer than protocol allowed, and made a choice that neither had planned but both had perhaps always been moving toward. The dress glowed steady gold between them, the color of honesty and hope and something very like love. And somewhere beyond the temple's ancient walls, the stars continued their eternal dance, patient witnesses to yet another small miracle in the vast, complicated, endlessly surprising universe.